she disappeared. And for a very short period of time, something happened inside that house that still cannot be clearly explained. And the most disturbing part is not just that she vanished, but that the timeline around her disappearance feels incomplete, almost like a section of reality itself has been removed, leaving behind fragments that don't fully connect. And when people try to reconstruct what happened, they always return to the same problem. There is a gap, a window of time that should contain answers, but instead only creates more questions. What makes this case so different from others? Because most missing person cases begin with confusion, but this one began with something heavier than confusion. It began with silence. No immediate signs of struggle. No clear evidence pointing in a direction. No timeline that smoothly explains movement from one place to another. Just a normal evening that suddenly breaks apart without warning. And that kind of break is what draws attention. Because when something doesn't follow a logical sequence, people instinctively feel that something is wrong. Was Nancy Guthrie expected to disappear? No, and that is one of the most important aspects of the case, because she lived a structured and predictable life. The kind where routines are not just habits, but patterns that others rely on to understand her behavior. And when someone like that suddenly vanishes, it doesn't take long for people to realize that something is not normal. Because the absence is immediate, it stands out. It disrupts expectations in a way that cannot be ignored. What happened on the night she disappeared? At first glance, nothing unusual. The evening followed a routine pattern. She spent time with family. There were no visible signs of stress or conflict. No indication that anything out of the ordinary was about to occur. And after that, she returned home, entered the house, and everything appeared exactly the way it should be, which is what makes the next part so difficult to understand. Because when a situation shifts from normal to unexplained, without a clear transition, it creates a kind of tension that is hard to resolve. When does the timeline start to break? After midnight. That is when things begin to change. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in subtle disruptions that only become significant when viewed together. Because individually, each detail might seem minor, but combined, they form a pattern that cannot be easily dismissed. And that pattern centers around a very specific window of time. What is the first unusual detail? A security camera near the property goes offline. And this is not just any random failure. It happens during the exact period when investigators believe something critical may have occurred. And that timing is what transforms a technical issue into something far more suspicious. Because when a recording device stops functioning at the precise moment it is needed most, it raises the question of whether that failure was accidental or intentional. Is that the only anomaly? No, almost at the same time, another system also fails to behave normally. A medical monitoring device associated with Nancy does not send its expected signal. And while this might appear unrelated, the overlap in timing makes it difficult to treat these events as independent. Because when two separate systems show irregularities in the same narrow window, it suggests that something may have disrupted the normal conditions inside the house. Could these events still be coincidence? It is possible, but unlikely when viewed together, because coincidences usually do not align so precisely with critical moments, and when they do, investigators are forced to consider alternative explanations, including the possibility that something external influenced both systems, even if the exact mechanism remains unclear. Was there anyone else near the house? There are reports of a figure seen in the area, a person wearing dark clothing with their face obscured, appearing at a time when no one expected anyone to be there. And while there is no definitive confirmation that this individual is connected to the disappearance, the timing alone keeps this detail at the center of discussion, because presence combined with timing creates suspicion, even without direct evidence. Does this mean there was an intruder? Not necessarily, and that is what makes this detail complicated. Because without confirmation, the figure exists in a space between possibility and uncertainty. It could be relevant or it could be unrelated, but as long as there is no clear explanation, it continues to influence how people interpret the case. What happens the next morning? This is when concern turns into alarm. Because Nancy does not respond, she does not follow her usual routine. And for someone whose life was highly structured, that absence is immediately noticeable, prompting family members to check on her. And what they find only deepens the mystery. Because the house itself does not present a clear explanation for what has happened. What was found inside the house? At first, nothing that clearly explains the disappearance. The environment appears largely unchanged, familiar, almost normal. But at the same time, something is missing. And that missing element is the most important one. Because Nancy is not there. And the absence of disturbance combined with the absence of the person creates a contradiction that is difficult to resolve. Were there signs that she left voluntarily? No clear signs, and this is one of the strongest points in the case. Because when someone leaves by choice, especially at that age, there are usually indicators, preparations, communication, movement, but none of those are clearly present here, which makes the voluntary departure theory increasingly difficult to support. Was there any evidence suggesting something else happened? There are indications that led investigators to treat the situation more seriously, including possible signs inside the house that raised concern. And while these details are not always publicly confirmed in full, they are enough to shift the investigation away from a simple missing person scenario toward something more complex and potentially more serious. How did investigators respond? They began to treat the home as a potential crime scene, which is a significant step because it reflects a shift in perspective from searching for someone who may have wandered off to investigating the possibility that something happened inside the house itself, and that shift changes how every piece of evidence is analyzed. What are the main theories? There are several, and none of them fully explain everything. One theory suggests that Nancy left the house on her own, but this conflicts with the lack of evidence supporting movement. Another theory suggests that someone else was involved, which raises questions about access, timing, and knowledge of her routine. And a third perspective considers the possibility that the truth involves a combination of factors, rather than a single clear cause. Why is the timeline so important? Because everything points back to that narrow window of time. The camera failure, the missing signal, the reported figure, all of it exists within a short period. And when multiple unexplained events occur in the same time frame, that time frame becomes the focal point of the entire investigation. Because whatever happened, happened there. Why hasn't the case been solved?
Because the available information does not form a complete and consistent picture. There are fragments, clues, possibilities, but no definitive connection that ties everything together in a way that leads to a clear conclusion. And without that connection, the case remains open, unresolved, and deeply unsettling.